Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by the 5-day Vendor Master File Cleanup. Do you trust the data in your vendor master file? Well, if you have less than 5,000 active vendor records and need to prepare for a vendor self-registration portal or for 1099 and 1042 IRS annual forms distribution, you are in luck. We have vendor validations including watch list screening, duplicate vendor review, vendor inactivation recommendations, and more. Go to DeborahRRichardson.com. That's DeborahRichardson.com/consulting, or email me at Deborah, DEBRA, at DeborahRRichardson.com for a quote today. Today, we have a guest, Geoffrey Simpson, a Ph.D. student in cybersecurity, who is also launching a startup called Breach Management LLC. Do you know which top 3 fraud risks you need to watch out for in 2020? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 61, Top 3 Fraud Risks Accounts Payable Teams Need to Watch Out For in 2020. Geoffrey Simpson is our guest today, and he is the founder of Breach Management LLC. And I'll let Geoffrey tell you more about Breach Management and then also his background. So welcome, Geoffrey.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah, for having me on. My name is Geoffrey Simpson, and I kind of my brief background is I have my undergrad degree in computer science. I decided to go out and work in the the corporate world for a little bit. Then I discovered I'm not the best corporate employee, and I actually moved on to working at startups. And I was always been interested in academia and going to school. So I went back about 10 years after I got my undergrad degree, go back and get my MBA. And I always had a motivation to start my own companies and have my own companies. So I got my MBA, and then opportunity presented itself, and I launched my first startup product and company. My first product is called Diner Connection, which is an online waitlist software for restaurants. Sends you a text message when your table's ready. I have customers across the U.S. and Canada that use that. As time proceeded on, I kind of decided to go back into academia and get a Ph.D. So I'm actually almost about halfway through getting my Ph.D. in computer science at the University of Tulsa. And as part of that, I've been able to do research into areas that we're going to talk about a little bit today: business email compromise, some spear phishing. Security in general. University of Tulsa is very strong in cybersecurity, and I'm right in the midst of it. And as part of that, I was taking some law classes, some cybersecurity law and policy classes. And it really popped in my head the process of, or at least you becoming aware of some of the cybersecurity laws and around data breaches in the United States specifically. And part of what I saw as a missing component, or at least a component that the other companies are doing not as effectively today. So whenever a data breach occurs, there's certain steps that companies need to take when a data breach occurs. The first step is obviously fixing the data breach, finding out about it and fixing what the problem was, what that happened. And the second part is, making sure that doesn't happen again. And then you need to notify all the affected consumers potentially. So if data breach involves, some personal identifiable information or HIPAA information, medical history, medical information about people, maybe their social security numbers, there's different laws in each of the 50 states that you have to comply with, and it's based on where the consumer actually lives and not where the breach happens. And so each of those states, you need to comply with the laws of each of those states. And so Breach Management is a company that I'm in the process of launching that is the outsourced on-demand. We do the breach notification services for these companies that have experienced data breaches. And so we handle everything from if you have to email the people or whether it's regular postal mail that you send to them. We work with the attorney generals in certain states, work with notifying media outlets. So we're really a full service breach notification services to companies who experience data breaches. So hope that does it for now.
I think that does it.
Great.
What's really good about breach management and coming up with that startup company is that even in my blogs and my podcasts, I always talk about prevention of fraudulent payments or prevention of breaches. And what I never think about is, what happens to those customers or those folks that are affected by the breach, and how do you notify them?
Right.
So I think that's a great place for you to be, especially nowadays with the increase of breaches and just cyber criminals always finding new ways to perpetrate fraud. So
yes.
I think that's a very good place to be in. Mm-hmm. And I will say, I may not have mentioned it on the podcast before, but I'm in Owasso, which is just about 20 minutes outside of Tulsa. I did not know that the University of Tulsa specialized in cybersecurity. So now let's take advantage of all of the knowledge that you've gained from the University of Tulsa and your Ph.D. studies, and let's talk about the top 3 fraud risk accounts payable teams need to watch out for in 2020. The first one that we're going to talk about is prevalent everywhere. It's all about the email scams. It's all about phishing, the BEC or business email compromise. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where a lot of my research is going into. That as you're well aware, and your listeners as well, is that the business email compromise is actually becoming quite prevalent. And according to the FBI, last year there was over $1.2 billion stolen through business email compromise. And the area that I'm really looking at and concerned about most, and what I've seen most in companies, is not just the general phishing. And we can train for that. And a lot of companies do train their employees to recognize general phishing emails. If it has a link in there, please click this link to log in, or information like that. So those can be taught towards, and those you can help your employees recognize those. And there's training plans around that. But what we're really concerned about is what we call spear phishing. And spear phishing is when the people doing the phishing scams are getting very, very specific in their emails, targeting specific people, using specific titles and specific people's names and their account information. So we've seen a lot of this, and it's growing in prevalence, because what's happening is the attackers will actually spend time and effort to find out information on these companies. Now, we see this both in public and private companies, and we actually see it more in private companies, but these attackers are doing their homework. I can give a few examples. Names are redacted, so I won't get anybody in trouble. But I've seen emails sent to a controller of a company, and the email name was from the CEO of the company, asking for funds to be transferred because of a business acquisition. So at this point in time, the company was actually doing an acquisition. It was not public information, but I don't know if the attackers just got lucky with that request or they had some other information. And so the controller was ready to transfer the money, wire transfer. Luckily, in this organization, they have a kind of a multi-factor authentication for wire transfers, in that they actually need verbal authorization to the bank from an officer of the company. And so they're able to stop that. But the phishing scams and the spear phishing are getting really, really specific to where you can't necessarily trust things just by looking at names. So that's kind of the main concern that I have and what we're seeing these days.
Yeah, so I like that internal control with the multi-factor authentication
Mhm.
for sending wires where there's a verbal requirement.
Mhm.
So that's really good. And with that email that came to the controller, was that a spoofed name of the CEO or had they actually taken the CEO's account over?
Right. So in this case, it was a spoofed name. So they had the correct name of the CEO. And then if you actually expanded the email address out and looked at the email, it was actually coming, I believe, from like a Verizon email. So it was some letters and
Yeah.
numbers at verizon.com, or it may have been yahoo.com. So some of those issues are training issues where we can
Mhm.
train employees to look to expand out the email address. There are some software you can add to email servers that will try to, catch these things whenever a name of a person, an employee, does not match up with their actual email. But
Yeah.
yeah, training is a big part of that.
Yeah, and some of those email controls can be that external, it'll notify you if
Hmm.
that email came from an external email address. Also, the fact that they have that internal control, because you can train them, that's fine, it needs to be done, but every employee cannot be 100% on 100% of the time.
Right.
At some point, that I or that L that is a capital I, you are just not going to, or all employees are just not going to see that. And so adding in those internal controls is what can save you from sending out that fraudulent payment, as what happened in that example.
Hmm.
The controller processed it, but it was not able to go through because of the MFA required at the bank. So that was really
Exactly.
good. And that's kind of what I preach, is to make sure that you put the training in place, you train your employees, you update your documents, and then you also put in some internal controls in case they don't work.
Right. And some of the scariest things we're seeing today is when attackers will actually hack into the Exchange servers or the
Yeah.
email servers, and will actually monitor the emails,
Yep.
and they're able to make changes to emails in process, like in transaction. And so when you are, as an employee, expecting a wire transfer number and you receive an email with a legitimate email address from the person you're expecting from, everything else looks perfect. There's nothing the employee can do through that email to think that it's not valid. And that's why multi-factor is so important, because if the employee would contact that person the wire transfers supposed to be coming from, or the wire information is coming from, to verbally authenticate the email. So we absolutely recommend multi-factor authentication on wire transfers, because of things like attackers getting into email servers. And it happens to big multinational corporations. The largest case I've seen this in, I had a colleague who was called as an expert witness about I believe an oil tanker who their company was actually caught by this man in the middle of attack, and they offloaded millions. I think the price was about $40 million that they're actually defrauded out of, because the attackers were able to change the wire information on the Exchange server, and they didn't do the multi-factor authentication there.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so that is really important. And I think too, a lot of folks, or at least everywhere out there, the first piece of advice given is to make sure that you call and you notify or verify the change in banking information, not just reply to the email, not just call to a phone number that's within the email, but use the information that you already have in your ERP system, in your vendor master file. And
Right.
I think, yeah, and I think that is very important. And then I also recommend that, once that information is changed, have some type of an automatic notification to the vendor to let them know that it's changed. The same way that you and I, get a notification if we make any changes to our bank account or our Amazon account or a Google account. We get an email that says, hey, you made this change. If you didn't make this change, notify us
Hmm.
immediately. And that's yet another way to notify your vendor that a change has
Hmm.
been made.
Yeah, and another suggestion for the employees is always follow the processes that are put in
Yes.
place, because they're there to protect you as an employee and the company. We saw another case to where it wasn't necessarily, it was business email compromise fraud, but in this case, the CFO, um, or at least the person in accounting and payroll had received an email from the CFO requesting change of banking information to where his paychecks are deposited. And the person, they have processes in place that they actually need to go and verify this with the employee. But in this case, they felt like the CFO needed special treatment and it was a rush case. And so they did not follow processes, and they changed that banking account information because they were trying to give special treatment to the CFO. But what happens is it was a fraudulent email, and they didn't. And so the company lost that money that they sent fraudulently.
And
But
that is social engineering at
mhm,
its best,
it
because it
is.
is tugging on your emotional response to, I want to do a great job. This is the CFO. Let me hurry up. It's urgent. They don't have to go through the same protocols.
Mhm.
And it's just social engineering at its best. And we could probably talk about this all day, but one of the things that I wonder is if we should just, within accounts payable, just ask the CFO or the CEO or any C-level suite that could be the target of spear phishing to just stop sending email requests for wires and changes to bank accounts, and let those go through the normal process of either the vendor sending it in or whomever the vendor's point of contact at your company deals with that vendor. Let them send it in. What do you think about that?
And that's where, you always need multi-factor authentication, but
Yeah.
the process that works best for your company is the one where you can have, without a doubt that you're doing the right thing. And some companies are more technology advanced, and so they do rely on email, maybe Slack, more of a modern, message type of thing. And it's, how tightly coupled are your systems with your vendor systems. Some companies are, electronically tied, so there's a more secure communication there with their vendors, and some aren't. So, it's what worked best for your company. Make sure that the fraud protections are in place.
Okay. And I hadn't thought about Slack. The messenger type software platforms like Slack or Skype, are those more secure than email? I would think so.
They are, especially when you're doing things like verifying account information,
Yeah.
when you need that face to face. Now, and this may be several years out, but we already have seen some proof of concepts with the deep fake videos,
Yes.
to where they're actually doing deep fake videos with video conferencing. So applications like Skype and things. And so right now it's still not the quality that can really, right now it's very low resolution quality. And so you're not going to get a 4K, video conference with somebody
Right.
doing a deep fake. But with the advances in technology, that may be in question as well in the next, 10, 20 years, to whether a video call with somebody is actually that person or not. And so
Wow.
there's always cases where technology is making gains, and a lot of time it is used for fraud because it is a high reward activity a lot of times.
Yeah, and there's been the deep fake, with the phone call. And I
Hmm.
know of some examples where that has happened in accounts payable, vendor maintenance. They'll get a phone call from whom they think is a C-level or even a vendor and make changes and think that that's the confirmation because it was a phone call. But really, you need to be the one that initiates that phone call.
Right.
And yeah, and so I think that's, at least for now, that is a good mitigation for the deep fake phone calls.
Hmm.
So again, we could probably talk about phishing and BEC and social engineering like the whole podcast, but
Hmm.
and I think it is critical going into 2020. But the second thing that we have is, just talking about those passwords and the shared logins. And I know that that's still a huge thing going into 2020. And I don't know, I remember where I saw it, but I saw a survey this week that said that 63% of workers still use the same passwords across all of their applications that they sign into for
Hmm.
work. So what's your take on passwords and shared logins?
Sure, and I have a couple takes, but the first, and we kind of already talked about it with wire transfer, but logins should be multi-factor logins, whether um, A password can be the first one, which is fine. But when you add on an additional level of security, what we're seeing is, authenticator apps, which actually will kind of like the old RSA style little keychain fobs that had different numbers that changed all the time. And that was a kind of one of the first multi-factor authentication that people are familiar with. But now we've moved on to, mobile applications that do the same kind of numbering thing. That's one way of doing a multi-factor authentication. Another way is doing the USB security keys. And I actually, for my personal accounts and my business accounts, I actually have two different security keys that I carry. And so those do the same type of authentication to where they change the numbers every once in a while. And then other people can use text messaging, even though in some cases those have been spoofed with the messages, or even phone calls that will like read a number out to you. You can use that for multi-factor authentication. So the first step in all scenarios is you should, even on your personal accounts, you should have multi-factor authentication. And I know, Google provides that with their Gmail, Microsoft offers that with their Office 365, Yahoo offers that with their email. So it's really a function that if it's available to you, you should use it, because so much of our digital life is done through email. If you lose a password for your banking account, and we've seen this to where you can request that change the password, and if they've hacked into your email account because you're using the same password you've been using for years and it's the same one used on something else, well, now they can change the password on your banking account because they're able to get into your email, request a new password, and it goes like that. So that's multi-factor. As I wouldn't set up corporate infrastructure right now without multi-factor authentication. And then the second part of that question about shared logins, it's never a good idea, in my opinion, to have shared logins. I know some legacy systems don't allow for that, but in these days, if you're a public company and you fall under SOX compliant or Sarbanes-Oxley, I mean, there's a lot of requirements around AP and accounting that you actually need all that audit trail with the logins and to all sorts of different systems. And it goes from IT, if you have your accounting system, the computer that's there, I mean, every login needs to be audited from the system administrator all the way down to everybody using that computer. And so in this day and age, it's certainly technically feasible that everybody have their own login and have multi-factor authentication on all their passwords and accounts.
All right. So I did find the source. It was the of that 63%. It was the 2019 Digital Work Trend Survey results, and they said that 63% of workers report using the same passwords for multiple work devices and or applications. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But to that point, what do you think about password managers?
So I think they're a great idea, and especially when we do have requirements for different passwords. And in the case that the systems aren't able to provide multi-factor authentication, having unique passwords and very strong passwords are important. And password managers, it's asking too much for people to have them memorize all their passwords for all these different systems, and we're starting to see now on some corporate environments to where they're requesting at least 15 characters minimum for a password. To ask people to memorize all those is just too much. And so password managers are a fantastic idea. We've actually seen in some corporate environments, because of the way that it's set up, when they whitelist websites, they've actually not allowed some password manager websites. Which is silly in this day and age, but I think they're a great idea, and they can be used to good purposes to help the infrastructure stay strong.
Well, and I'll just say personally, and in my business, I use a password manager. I actually use LastPass, and I'm not affiliated with them at all, and I don't know about any other password managers. I just have used them probably for a little over a year now, and I actually love it because I don't even need to know, what that password is. I don't need to think of anything. It'll automatically generate it, and it's just been great for me because now I don't know what the passwords are, which means that I no longer have the same password across multiple sites, because it was hard.
Yeah, and they offer multi-factor authentication just to use their application. So
Yes.
you can buy one of these key fobs, a UB key, or Google has their key fob that they have to do this. So if you are concerned about this, and they actually have Bluetooth versions, USB versions. So even on your mobile device, if you need to use that, you can use that little key thing keep it on your key fob and push the button, and it will provide that multi-factor authentication for all your accounts.
Yeah, and the other thing about it too is it's very, at least for me, it's very cost efficient, because I know in the past, before, years ago, before you really started looking at having passwords automatically generated using a password manager, I actually paid for a service just to record all the different passwords that I had, just to store them, so I didn't have to remember them all, and I could have one place where they were stored. And this password manager is less than that, and I think that was $29.99 a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're very cost effective, and I'm very happy with it. So yeah, it solved the problem for me and my business, and also personally. So I highly recommend password managers.
Yeah, and there are some built into web browsers, like
Yeah.
or Google Chrome has one built in where they'll generate strong passwords and store those for you. I believe Firefox has the same thing. And so,
Yeah.
at the minimum, for at least your web accounts, web application accounts, they can provide that. If that's all you need, maybe that's a good solution for you as well.
Yep. All right. So the third broad risk for 2020 is USB drives. And I know you talked a little bit about USB drives. And so can you expand on that? What do you think about USB drives going into 2020?
Well, sure, and they're so convenient because, back in the day when we had floppy disks and things like that, and you couldn't fit very much on there. It was very cumbersome to move data around, and even before networks. And so the advent of USB flash drives has just been fantastic, and I use
Right.
them, and most everybody uses USB flash drives. Uh, the bad thing about USB flash drives is that they can be used maliciously by attackers. There's a couple ways that they can do that. They can put malicious code on there to try and run whenever you plug in the USB drive. Some USB drives can actually be created to imitate a keyboard, and so they could actually start entering commands in your computer when you plug them in. This all sounds very scary, and you think, okay, when I go buy a flash drive at Walmart or Office Depot, I shouldn't have to be concerned about that. And you're right, but the problem is there are people who would potentially maliciously attack companies, and let's say they have 100 USB flash drives, they get those printed up with the company's logo on them, and they go and sprinkle those around the parking lot of the company. And what if they put a file on there that says, company salary list .xls for Excel file? We've seen studies that almost all flash drives are picked up by somebody if they find them in a parking lot or on a sidewalk or something, or outside the building. And we find that at least half of those, on average, are actually inserted into company computers within a day or two. And so the scary part is you can have the best IT department in the world who has the best firewalls set up so nobody can attack from the outside electronically. But all it takes is one person picking up a flash drive in a parking lot and putting it in their computer, and suddenly malicious attackers have access to the network. And so that's the really scary thing about USB drives. And I know we were talking beforehand how in some corporate environments they disable the USB drives.
Yeah.
We've seen this, even in the voting systems in the United States. Some of the electronic ones are built on computers, and they have the USB drives exposed, which is potentially dangerous because hackers could, maybe change those settings to allow those. In some environments, they actually use epoxy glue to actually fill the USB connections. So that's one way of preventing people from using USB devices. But they can be very dangerous in these scenarios, and it's something that it's a training issue as well. We go back to employee training, that you do have to kind of teach people to trust the drives, maybe that they are purchased directly from places and that are maintained securely. But it is not okay just to pick up flash drives even in the parking lot and try them out.
Yeah, and I've heard of instances where they, just arrive, in mail rooms. And
Hmm.
so I don't know if it's the employee's curiosity or, if they're trying to be that good Samaritan to try to figure out, who dropped it and
Hmm.
where to give it back to, especially if it's in your company parking lot, because you may think it's a team member's flash
Right.
drive. But I will say, if you were back in the late 80s, early 90s, with those, what were those big floppy disks?
Yeah, they had that 5.25-inch floppy drives, and
Yeah.
before that, they had even larger, like 8-inch floppy drives, which were even before the personal computer times. But yeah, they were. Yeah,
Well, I
I've been
remember
around
I
that long.
remember using the 5-inch ones, and then I
Mhm.
remember being so excited when we got the little floppy disk, and then
Mhm.
I remember being ultra excited when the USB drives came out. And
Yeah,
so I guess it's gone full circle now.
it has, and I don't want to discourage people from picking up USB drives at trade shows, because those are, you always see those people getting them out at trade shows and things. But just be cautious about where you get the flash drives from, and yeah, be careful.
Yeah, especially not at airports either. So
Yeah.
the USB drives or equipment that just, appears there for you conveniently to, charge your device, that's not recommended either, right?
Right. Yeah.
All right, so this has been really good. Any closing thoughts for, being safe and reducing fraud in 2020?
A lot of it's just being aware of things going on, and having multi-factor authentication, for wire transfers. You probably do the same thing with your written checks. Just be as careful, because if somebody, luckily we have processes in place for checks, but we don't always have processes in place for wire transfers. And because they can potentially steal more money, it's more important to be aware of that. With a check, usually you know where you're mailing it. We do see a lot of fraud from the vendor employees that would potentially take checks that are to the vendor, and they'll go and try to cash those or change the name on them. But at least companies can get the check images from the bank and
Right.
authenticate or verify them.
And have that positive pay.
Yeah, the positive pay, and that works great. But with a wire transfer, if they can wire transfer, if it gets dropped into account and they can wire transfer it out of the company, it's gone. So if you are a victim of something like that, wire transfer, business email compromise, contact your local authorities, your law enforcement, contact the FBI. They have an internet crime complaint center to where they do specialize in wire transfer fraud and business email compromise. And so they actually can do recovery if you contact them soon enough and give them enough detail. And so working with your law enforcement officials and the FBI is a first step you should do when you discover the fraud has occurred in these instances. So it's not just something that one person can solve. It can't just be your accounts payable. It's working with IT, it's working with accounts payable, it's working with your vendors, working with your bank. Everybody has to be on board to help fight this fraud.
Well, I think that's well put. Where can everyone go to learn more about breach management or connect with you?
Sure, we're still launching the company, and so there's not a lot of information online, but my email is g@breach.management. My other company that we do custom software application development, and the one that has Diner connection is Spiked Mace Software. So you can contact me or visit the website at spikedmace.com, or my email is jeffrey@spikedmace.com.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Geoffrey
You're
Simpson, for
welcome.
being on the show.
I enjoyed it. Thank you for having me, Deborah.
So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 61st episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.